exercise. This is lab 4, the first exercise. All right. So in this exercise, we create a new project in this solution. It's an empty project. We added a bunch of side columns. A side column is a reusable column definition. In here, we have a column called Contractor Manager. The type is a user, so when it's associated with a list and you're trying to create a list item, it's going to ask you to pick a user or supply the user. Contractor team is a choice. Okay, these are all the teams in Contractor. So these elements.xml declaratively creates these side columns. Now these side columns are bundled into this feature called Contracting Resources. Resource. Great. Plural. Okay, so these contracting resource feature included these side column. Okay. And also this feature has a title and a description and where the feature will appear. The feature will appear in site collection. So using the solution, it dragged and dropped these site columns to the project and make sure the feature included them. In this lab exercise, in exercise 2, we're going to add a feature receiver class. So whenever someone activates this feature, okay, we are going to create a new content type that's based on these side columns that we have just deployed. So right-click on the feature and say we would like to add an event receiver. Now this will bring up a class that inherits from the SP feature receiver, and all we need to do is to say on what event do we want to run codes. So uncomment this to handle the feature activated, uncomment that to handle feature deactivated. Control KU. To copy some of these code from the solution version, you can find from the solution folder under features, contracting resources. Okay, you'll find the contracting resource event receiver.cs. Now, what you're trying to copy is only the part inside of these overrides. Okay, so the first thing we want to do is to set up a hard-coded content type ID. Okay. Now, these content type ID has a rule to follow. Okay, the first four digits, we call it. Okay, decide what is the base type, and subsequently is the GUID. So that's the base content type, and we're going to create our own custom content type off of 101. All right. So in a feature activated, I'm just going to copy this whole override and paste over. Now it looks like these are all busy works, folks. They're not complicated work, but just busy work. All right, so this properties give us a reference, so we can say where is the site collection that this feature is being deployed to, so we can quickly get a reference. So this line here gives us a reference to which site collection we're deploying this to. Once we have the site collection, we're going to the root web By using this hard-coded site content ID, we can find out, has this content type been deployed already? Okay. If it's null, if it returns null, that means we don't have that content type. So we're going to new one up, call that content type contractor agreement with that hard-coded ID, and add that to the root web's content types collection. Okay. It doesn't have any column yet. It's just a brand new content type with no information on them. So we are populating the description and the group where the content type should reside. And then here is the busy work of finding a column called full name and add that column, add that field to the content type. Okay, so if the contracting content type, which is what we just added, contracting CT, if that content type does not yet have a full name field, then we're going to add that to the field links. And we repeat this step for the Contaso Manager site column, Contaso Team site column, Daily Rate column, agreement start date, agreement end date. Now this is why copy and paste for this instance makes sense, because if these are typoed, you won't find these site columns. Alright, so here are these making all the links to the content types, and finally update the content type back. So that's our feature activation. So folks, focus on the features, not the busy work of creating the content type. Alright, and don't forget, it's always a good idea to clean up when the feature is deactivated. So this is the code that, let's find out what happens when we deactivate the features. Okay, again, we're trying to find that content type ID. And if we find it, we're going to go ahead and delete it. Obviously, if somebody else deleted the content type before we did, we don't want to throw an exception, so we put in the safety code to make sure the content type is still there before we try to delete it from the web.contenttypes collection. Alright, so that's the event receiver, and that code runs. Okay, when the feature is activated. All right. So that is task 2 and task 3 in this lab. All right, so all that is remaining is to give this a spin. All right, so I'm going to rebuild the solution, and if I have kept my case sensitivity and type project names correct, this should compile. If I messed up on some namespace, this will give me an error. All right, so far it looks good. So I'm going to do a quick debug. Start without debugging. Now remember, the workflow for the default deployment is to deploy the solution, activating the feature. Now it's also worth noting while you do your debugging to read over the output so you know what it's doing exactly. So it's doing the default deployment configuration. There is no pre-deployment command. We didn't specify it. We didn't have to recycle the application pool because it has not been deployed before. Skipping the package retraction because we don't have the solution yet. So here we're going to say add solution. Deploying the solution. Activating the feature. All right, so at the end of it, it brings up the team.contaso.com, and we ought to be able to verify that site column now exists, and more importantly, the content type should also be available. Okay. And again, the reason the content type will be there, it's because our feature receiver. So graphically, here's your SharePoint. Here's your Visual Studio. You create and build a solution. You have to deploy it in order for you to see it, to verify it, to debug it. And when your debug session is done, you can choose to retract it. Now, anytime you make modification to your solution, it does not magically appear on the server. You have to retract the existing solution. So when you make changes, you first have to retract solution with matching ID. Okay, so it's going to base on the grid of the solution to say, hey, is this solution already available on the server? If so, retract it so that our updated solution, can now be uploaded again so we can see our changes. Okay, so it will retract the solution with matching ID, and 2, deploy new solution. So bear in mind, this is what happens. Okay, nothing, no development against SharePoint happens in real time. It's always build, deploy. If you need to change something, you have to retract and redeploy them. Now, conveniently, you can always right-click on the project and say deploy or retract. And it's going to attempt to contact your SharePoint server stated when you create the project, right? The SharePoint we're talking to is team.contaso.com. That's our site URL. Okay, so it's going to deploy and retract from there. Okay, this can be used to deploy site columns, content types. You can even add and remove things from the site setting menu, and there's a whole bunch of things you can do with these feature receiver. All right, any questions, folks? That's exercise 2 of module 4 lab. So in the solution folder, I have this contract agreement list. All right, this adds things to it, and let's just make sure it really works. So here's a contract agreement list, and you'll see the designer includes the various columns. Okay. All right, and this is where the list title is going to be, and the list URL. Fantastic. All right, so apparently this list will depend on the content type of that. Now, it's important that you don't change the ID, because in exercise 3, the list depends on that content type. Okay, so that's 36F9 must match exactly with the content type that we programmatically created. Remember that content type that we programmatically created in the event receiver, it has to match exactly. Okay, so if it's mismatched, then this list will not have a content type. All right, exercise 3 is about demonstrating dependencies between features. So we want a separate feature to deploy this list. Okay, so here we're going to go ahead and add a new feature. This feature will deploy the contractor agreement list. Okay. So this particular feature, when activated, it will provision or create using the content type that we defined earlier. All right. So the scope is set to web. Perfect. All right. And the item that we are trying to deploy here is the list. Okay, so double click on that. We'll move that to the item in the feature. All right, so naturally this list depends on the presence of the content type. So to demonstrate the activation dependency, we're going to say add a dependency to contracting management resources. So these depends on another feature in the same solution. You could also have a dependency on external features, so long as you know the feature ID. Okay, you can plug them in there. So right now I'm just going to select this item that's in the same solution. All right. All right, so I think that's pretty much it. We're going to go ahead and do a start without debugging. Now, if everything went all right, both features would be activated by the deployment procedure set here. Now you can also switch to use the no activation deployment, so in which case the feature will be deployed but will not be activated. So let's go to our site settings. Now we should go to the site feature. And there is a contractor agreement list that's currently active. Now we can confirm that because there is a list now, contractor agreement list, right, with all the columns and what have you. All right, so you can actually see the list there, and there's all the columns. So let's go back to the site settings. Now I'm going to go ahead and deactivate both the contractor agreement list as well as the site collection feature. That is the contract management resource. So I've deactivated both. Because of the dependency settings, all right, something went wrong. What went wrong? Care to elaborate? What went wrong? What the dependency has, by the way, when you come and review these recordings, you'll find that all that something went wrong magically disappear from recording because there's a nice little pause button that I press whenever something goes wrong, so they don't actually show up. They just magically work. All right. So anyways, I went ahead and delete all these list the library that depends on the content type, so I can deactivate that feature. And dependency simply means when I go to the site feature, and goes about and activate. All right. Cool. Now this is called cross-site dependency. Okay, cross-scope dependency. This is not an error. It's just saying you have a site-scoped feature that depends on the site collection scope feature. The dependency is okay. It's just that by defining such dependency, you are not allowed to activate this feature without activating that feature first. This is called the cross-site dependency. All right. Sorry, cross-scope dependency. Cross-scope dependency. Had those two features in the same scope, the activation would be automatic. Okay, so that's what that cross-scope dependency means. All right, so I'm going to go back to the site, and this time make sure I turn on the dependent site collection features. Contract. management resource, have this activated. So that's all set. So going to the site feature now. All right. I will be able to enable the contractor activating that feature and make that list pop up. Whew, isn't it something? All right, so that concludes this lab.